Grandma, why haven't you visited your lake house yet? My grandson asked the question so casually that at first I thought I had misheard him. The noise of Christmas dinner continued around me. Plates clinked. Someone laughed at the far end of the table. A football game played softly on the television in the living room. For a moment, I simply stared at him. My what? I asked. 8-year-old Noah looked up from his mashed potatoes and blinked. Your lake house, he repeated. Dad said you helped buy it. Mom says it's the reason we get to spend summers there. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. The room suddenly felt warmer than it had a second earlier. I glanced across the table at my son, Ethan. His smile disappeared so quickly that I almost doubted I had seen it. Beside him, my daughter-in-law Vanessa reached for her water glass. Neither of them answered. Neither of them looked at me. I'm Ava Thompson. I'm 71 years old, a widow, and until that Christmas evening, I believed I knew everything important about my family. I believed that after my husband died 12 years ago, every sacrifice I made had helped my son build a stable future. I believed the monthly payments I sent were helping him through difficult years. I believed many things. Looking back now, I realize belief can be a dangerous thing when it's placed in the wrong hands. Noah, Vanessa said with a nervous laugh, why don't you tell Grandpa's old fishing story again? She changed the subject too quickly. Too smoothly. The kind of smooth that comes from practice. Noah shrugged and returned to eating. Around the table, conversations resumed. Christmas music drifted from a speaker in the kitchen. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon filled the house. To everyone else, it probably seemed like nothing had happened. But something had happened. A crack had appeared in a picture I had trusted for years. I looked around the dining room. The house was beautiful. Larger than anything Ethan had grown up in. The hardwood floors gleamed beneath the chandelier. Through the windows I could see snow gathering along the backyard fence. Everything looked comfortable, successful, secure. And suddenly, I found myself wondering how much of that security had been built with money I had spent more than a decade sending without question. Later that evening, while everyone exchanged gifts around the tree, I noticed Ethan watching me. Not smiling, not relaxed. Watching, as if he was waiting to see whether I would ask questions. I didn't. Not then. Sometimes silence reveals more than confrontation ever can. When I finally drove home to my small apartment 20 miles away, snowflakes drifted across my windshield under the glow of the streetlights. The heater hummed softly. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. I kept hearing Noah's voice. Your lake house. The words followed me all the way home. That night I sat alone at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold beside me. Outside, Christmas lights blinked across neighboring balconies. Inside, I opened an old file cabinet and began searching through 12 years of records. Because for the first time, I wasn't wondering whether something was wrong. I knew it was. And I intended to find out exactly what had been hidden from me. I did not sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan's face across the Christmas dinner table. Not angry. Not surprised. Worried. It was the expression that stayed with me as dawn slowly brightened the sky outside my apartment window. By 6 o'clock, I was already sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by folders, envelopes, and bank statements. The apartment was quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock and the occasional hum of the refrigerator. I had lived there for nearly 12 years. It was comfortable enough, but small. 1 bedroom. 1 bathroom. Just over 700 square feet. After my husband passed away, I sold our family home because Ethan convinced me it was the practical thing to do. He had been struggling financially back then. At least that was what I believed. He told me he wanted to build a secure future for his family. He told me temporary help would make all the difference. I remember sitting beside him at a diner one rainy afternoon shortly after the funeral. He looked exhausted. Vanessa was pregnant with Noah at the time. Ethan explained that mortgage payments, medical bills, and everyday expenses were piling up. I wanted to help. What mother would not? So we reached an arrangement. Every month, I would send money until they got back on their feet. At first it was $500, then $700. Eventually it became $1,000 each month. sometimes more. Whenever Ethan called saying they were facing unexpected expenses, I found a way to contribute. I skipped vacations. I postponed replacing my aging car. I ignored small luxuries that most people my age enjoyed. None of it felt like sacrifice back then. It felt like love. As the morning passed, I began organizing 12 years of records into neat stacks. January through December. Year after year. Transfer after transfer. The numbers seemed unreal when viewed together. Thousands became tens of thousands. Tens of thousands became well over $100,000. My hands trembled slightly as I calculated the total. I had never added everything before. I trusted my son. Trust has a way of making people careless with details. Around noon, I opened an old metal box where I kept important family documents. Inside were tax returns, insurance papers, and several greeting cards Ethan had sent over the years. One card caught my attention. It was from 9 years earlier. The message was short. Thank you for helping us build something that will stay in the family forever. At the time, I thought he meant stability. A future. Security for Noah. Now the words felt different. Deliberate. I read the sentence 3 times before setting the card aside. Outside, children were playing in the snow near the apartment complex parking lot. Their laughter drifted faintly through the window. I stared at the stack of papers in front of me and felt a strange mixture of sadness and determination. Whatever had happened, it had not started yesterday. It had been unfolding for years. And for the first time, I was beginning to understand that the answers were buried somewhere within those 12 years of trust. The next morning, I decided to stop guessing and start looking for facts. By then, the stack of documents on my kitchen table had grown so large that it covered nearly every inch of the surface. Bank statements, tax records, old receipts, greeting cards, even handwritten notes I had almost forgotten existed. For years, I had viewed those papers as simple reminders of responsibilities fulfilled. Now they felt more like pieces of a puzzle I had never intended to solve. Around 10 o'clock, I made myself a cup of coffee and opened an old photo album that had been sitting untouched on a bookshelf. I was not looking for evidence. I was looking for memories. Sometimes the difference matters. The album began with pictures of Ethan as a little boy, school photographs, birthday parties, family vacations. Then I reached the years after my husband passed away. The images changed. Ethan appeared older. Vanessa appeared in nearly every picture. Noah was born. Family gatherings became less frequent. What caught my attention was not what I saw. It was what I did not see. There were entire stretches of time missing. Summers. Holidays. Weekends. At the time, I had accepted their explanations. They were busy. Work was demanding. Travel plans changed. Life happened. Looking back, the pattern felt different. I remembered several occasions when I had asked to visit and been told it was not a good time. One summer, they claimed the house was undergoing repairs. Another year, they said they were spending the season with friends. At the time, I never questioned any of it. I trusted them. That afternoon, I called Ethan. The phone rang 4 times before he answered. His voice sounded unusually cautious. We exchanged a few polite words about Christmas before I asked a simple question. Ethan, what exactly was Noah talking about at dinner? The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Kids say all kinds of things, Mom, he replied. You know how they are. I stared out my apartment window at the gray winter sky. Do I? I asked. Another pause. Then he laughed softly. Not naturally. Not comfortably. You are reading too much into it. The conversation ended a few minutes later. Nothing had been resolved. Yet I felt more certain than ever that something was wrong. That evening I found myself scrolling through social media. I rarely used it, but curiosity can make people learn new habits quickly. Ethan posted very little. Vanessa posted constantly. Family photos. Vacation pictures. Holiday gatherings. I moved slowly through years of posts until one image stopped me cold. It showed Noah standing beside a large stone fireplace. Behind him hung a wooden sign that read Thompson Family Lake House. I leaned closer to the screen. The room looked beautiful. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a lake shimmering beneath summer sunlight. Everyone was there. Ethan, Vanessa, Noah, even relatives from Vanessa's side of the family. Everyone except me. I checked the date. The photograph had been posted 6 years earlier. 6 years. I sat back in my chair and felt a heaviness settle over me. Whatever this place was, it was not new. It had been part of their lives for years. Years during which I had been sending money every month while living in a modest apartment 20 miles away. For the first time, a question formed in my mind that I could not push aside. If they had hidden the house from me for this long, what else had they hidden? The following morning, I could not stop thinking about that photograph. I printed a copy and placed it beside the stack of financial records on my table. The image seemed harmless at first glance. A smiling family. A summer afternoon. A beautiful view of the water. Yet the longer I studied it, the more details began to emerge. Small details. The kind that only matter when trust has already begun to crack. The sign above the fireplace looked professionally made, not something purchased on a whim. The furniture matched throughout the room. The windows overlooked a private dock extending into the lake. This was not a vacation rental. This was a property someone intended to keep for years. I enlarged the photograph on my computer screen and searched through older posts. Within an hour, I found more pictures. Dozens of them. Summer barbecues. 4th of July celebrations. Thanksgiving weekends. Birthday parties. Year after year. The same house appeared again and again. The same lake. The same dock. The same stone fireplace. In one picture, Noah looked no older than 3 years old. In another, he was learning to fish from the end of the dock. I checked the dates carefully. The oldest photograph had been posted nearly 10 years earlier. 10 years. My chest tightened as I leaned back in my chair. During those same years, I had continued sending money every month. I remembered the conversations clearly. Ethan telling me they were struggling. Vanessa explaining that expenses were higher than expected. Unexpected repairs. School costs. Medical bills. Temporary setbacks that always seemed to require one more payment. One more sacrifice. One more transfer from my account. That afternoon, I drove to the bank where I had maintained my accounts for nearly 30 years. The manager, a kind woman named Rebecca, recognized me immediately. She helped me request archived transaction records dating back more than a decade. It took some time, but eventually the documents began arriving. Page after page. Transfer after transfer. The numbers formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. I sat in my car afterward and reviewed the totals. By my estimate, I had contributed well over $150,000 through the years. Perhaps more. The realization left me staring through the windshield long after the engine had been turned off. On the drive home, memories surfaced that I had not considered in years. Times when Ethan discouraged me from visiting unexpectedly. Holidays that were suddenly canceled. Invitations that never arrived. I had always assumed life was simply busy. Now those memories felt different. Deliberate. Carefully managed. That evening my phone rang. Vanessa's name appeared on the screen. I almost did not answer. When I finally did, her voice sounded unusually cheerful. She asked whether I had arrived home safely after Christmas. She spoke about the weather and upcoming plans for Noah's school activities. The conversation felt strangely rehearsed. Then she asked a question that made my heart skip. "You are not upset about anything Noah said at dinner, are you?" I looked at the photograph beside me. The lake house. The smiling faces. The missing years. Why would I be upset? I asked quietly. There was a brief pause before she answered. No reason at all. The line went silent for a moment. And in that silence, I knew she was afraid that I had finally started asking the right questions. For the next several days, I stopped looking for explanations and started looking for evidence. There is a difference. Explanations are built on trust. Evidence survives without it. Every morning I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, a calculator, and another stack of records. Outside, winter settled across the city. Snow collected along the sidewalks. Cars moved slowly through the neighborhood. Inside my apartment, The only sound was the turning of pages and the occasional scratch of my pen. By Thursday afternoon, I had created a timeline covering nearly 12 years. Dates, transfers, conversations I could remember, family events. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Nearly every major payment I had made was followed by a period when Ethan seemed unusually relieved. Sometimes he called to thank me. Sometimes Vanessa sent a thoughtful card. Sometimes they invited me to dinner. Looking back, those moments felt less like gratitude and more like maintenance. Small gestures designed to keep me comfortable enough not to ask questions. Then I found something unexpected. Buried among old paperwork was a folder from the year I sold my house after my husband passed away. Most of the documents were exactly what I expected. Closing statements, tax forms, bank deposits. But one page caught my attention immediately. It was a handwritten note from Ethan. I remembered receiving it years ago. At the time it had made me cry because I believed it came from love. Now I read it differently. The note said, "Mom, one day we'll see what your help made possible for our family." I stared at the sentence for a long time. What exactly had become possible? That evening I searched online property records. I did not expect to find much. In fact, I almost convinced myself not to try. But curiosity has a strange way of growing stronger once the truth begins to surface. The county database required patience. Addresses, names, public filings. I spent nearly 2 hours searching before I finally found a record connected to Ethan. My pulse quickened. The property existed. It sat on the edge of a lake less than 90 miles from where I lived. The purchase date stopped me cold. It matched almost perfectly with the period when my monthly contributions had increased dramatically. I read the filing again. Then a third time. Ethan's name appeared on the ownership records. Vanessa's name appeared as well. Mine did not. Not anywhere. I leaned back slowly in my chair. The room felt unusually quiet. Outside, darkness had already settled across the parking lot. A neighbor walked a dog beneath the streetlights. Somewhere down the hall, a television played softly. Life continued exactly as it always had. Yet nothing felt the same. For 12 years I had believed I was helping my son survive difficult circumstances. Now I was beginning to suspect I had been helping build something I was never supposed to know existed. Before going to bed, I printed every document I had found and placed them neatly inside a folder. Then I wrote a single question across the top page. If they had nothing to hide, why was everything hidden from me? As I turned off the kitchen light, I realized I was no longer searching for a possibility. I was following a trail. And that trail was leading somewhere neither Ethan nor Vanessa wanted me to go. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of calling Ethan again or confronting Vanessa, I contacted someone I had not spoken to in years. Margaret Collins had been my husband's attorney for nearly 2 decades. After his passing, she handled several estate matters with patience and professionalism. We exchanged holiday cards for a few years and then gradually lost touch, as people often do. I found her number in an old address book and called her office shortly after 9 o'clock. To my surprise, she answered personally. Her voice sounded older than I remembered, but still sharp. After a few minutes of catching up, I explained that I needed help understanding some property records. She agreed to meet me the following afternoon. When I arrived at her office, the familiar scent of paper and coffee greeted me. Margaret listened quietly while I explained everything from the Christmas dinner conversation to the records I had discovered online. She never interrupted. She simply took notes and occasionally adjusted her glasses. When I finished, she sat silently for several seconds. Then she asked a question I had not expected. "Ava, do you still have copies of the larger transfers you made during those years?" I nodded and slid the folder across her desk. She reviewed the documents carefully. Her expression changed little, but I noticed her eyes narrowing at certain pages. Finally, she placed the folder down and folded her hands. "There is something unusual here," she said. My heart immediately began to race. Margaret explained that the timing of several transfers aligned very closely with the acquisition and development of the lake property. That alone did not prove wrongdoing. Families help one another financially all the time. But what caught her attention was something else. Several payments were labeled with notes referencing investments, future ownership, or family property. I stared at her. I barely remembered writing some of those descriptions on the transfer forms. At the time, they seemed insignificant. Margaret asked whether anyone had ever discussed placing my name on the property. Suddenly, a memory surfaced. It was faint but unmistakable. Years ago, Ethan had mentioned that one day I would have a place by the water where I could relax during retirement. I remembered smiling and telling him that sounded wonderful. I had assumed it was simply a dream. A casual conversation. Margaret leaned back in her chair. Sometimes, she said carefully, people reveal more in casual conversations than they realize. Before I left, she asked permission to conduct a deeper search into public filings connected to the property. I agreed immediately. 2 days later, she called. Her voice carried a seriousness that made my stomach tighten before she even spoke. Ava, I found something. I sat down at my kitchen table and gripped the phone tightly. Margaret explained that during the earliest stages of the property's purchase, documents existed that referenced an ownership structure different from the final filing. Not definitive proof. Not yet, but enough to raise important questions. Questions about who was originally intended to benefit from the property. Questions about why certain records appeared incomplete. Questions about whether someone had worked very hard to ensure I remained unaware of what was happening. After the call ended, I sat alone in silence. The winter sun was beginning to set outside my window. Long shadows stretched across the room. For the first time since this investigation began, I felt something stronger than confusion. Someone knew exactly what they were doing all those years. And whatever the full truth turned out to be, it was buried much deeper than I had imagined. For several days after Margaret's call, I did nothing outwardly different. I paid my bills. I grocery shopped. I attended my weekly church group. If Ethan or Vanessa had been watching me, they would have seen the same quiet woman they had always known. But inside, something had changed. I was no longer reacting to discoveries. I was preparing for answers. The following week, Margaret invited me back to her office. When I arrived, a thick folder sat neatly on her desk. She opened it slowly and slid several pages toward me. I think you should see this yourself, she said. The first document was dated almost 12 years earlier. It related to the property purchase. I scanned the page carefully. Then I froze. There, buried within the paperwork, was a reference to a proposed family ownership arrangement connected to future contributions. My name appeared in the supporting notes. Not as a casual lender. Not as someone making gifts. As a contributing family member whose financial participation had been formally acknowledged during preliminary planning discussions. I read the line 3 times before looking up. Margaret nodded quietly. Your name did not make it into the final ownership structure, she said. But these documents show that your involvement was discussed from the beginning. My throat tightened. For years I had blamed myself for being naive. Now I was staring at proof that I had not imagined those old conversations. With Ethan. They had been real. The idea that I would someday benefit from the property had existed long before it disappeared. Margaret showed me additional records. Email references. Financial timelines. Meeting summaries. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would make headlines. But together they told a story. A story of gradual changes. Adjustments. Decisions made without my knowledge. Each step seemed small on its own. Together they painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. On the drive home, I took a different route. Instead of returning directly to my apartment, I followed the highway north toward the lake. 90 miles passed beneath gray winter skies. Bare trees lined the roads. Small towns appeared and disappeared behind me. Eventually, I reached the area shown in the property records. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I turned onto a quiet road near the water. Then I saw it. The house stood exactly as it had in the photographs. Large windows faced the lake. A long dock stretched into the water. Even in winter, the property looked beautiful. I parked along the roadside and sat silently. For nearly 20 minutes, I simply looked at it. The place I had unknowingly helped build. The place where birthdays had been celebrated. Holidays enjoyed. Summers remembered. A place that had existed in my family's life for more than a decade while remaining completely absent from mine. Then a vehicle pulled into the driveway. Ethan stepped out. A few seconds later, Vanessa appeared beside him. They laughed about something as they carried bags toward the front door. Neither noticed my car. Neither knew I was there. I watched them disappear inside. The door closed behind them. And in that moment, sitting alone across the road, I realized something painful. The greatest betrayal was not the money. It was the years. The years of memories created behind that door while I remained outside, believing I was helping build a future that would someday include me. When I returned to my apartment that evening, I did not feel angry. That surprised me. For weeks I had imagined what I might feel if my suspicions were confirmed. Rage. Heartbreak. Betrayal. Instead, I felt something colder. Clarity. I placed the folder Margaret had prepared on my kitchen table and sat quietly beside it. The documents no longer represented questions. They represented answers. The uncertainty that had haunted me since Christmas was gone. What remained was a simple decision. What would I do with the truth? The next morning, Margaret called again. She had spent several more hours reviewing records and correspondence connected to the property. Some of the information was public. Some came from archives that required formal requests. Together, the documents painted an increasingly complete picture. The property had been acquired shortly after I began making larger financial contributions. Improvements had followed over the years. Additions, renovations, landscaping. Every major stage seemed to align with periods when Ethan and Vanessa claimed they were facing financial hardship. Margaret never accused anyone directly. She simply organized facts. Facts have a way of speaking for themselves. By the end of the conversation, we agreed on a strategy. No dramatic confrontation. No emotional arguments. No accusations shouted across a dinner table. Those things rarely produce truth. Instead, we would gather everything carefully and allow the evidence to stand on its own. During the following week, I continued my normal routine. I even accepted an invitation to lunch from Ethan. We met at a small restaurant near his office. He seemed nervous from the moment he arrived. He asked about my health, my church group, the weather, topics that required no honesty. I answered politely. Then he looked directly at me and asked whether everything was all right. It was the first truly direct question he had asked in weeks. I smiled and told him I was doing fine. The relief that crossed his face lasted only a second, but I noticed it. People reveal themselves most clearly when they think danger has passed. Later that evening, I received several photographs from Vanessa. Family pictures. Noah playing basketball. Weekend outings. Smiling faces. At first glance, they appeared thoughtful. Yet something about them felt different now. They reminded me of the cards and phone calls that had always appeared whenever financial discussions surfaced. Small gestures. Careful timing. Familiar patterns. I thanked her politely and said nothing more. A few days later, Margaret informed me that formal letters were ready. Not lawsuits. Not demands. Simply requests for clarification supported by documented records. Questions that deserved answers. Questions that could no longer be ignored. I held the envelope in my hands for a long time before mailing it. 12 years of trust had brought me to that moment. 12 years of assumptions. Sacrifices. Promises. As the envelope disappeared through the slot at the post office, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. For the first time since Noah's innocent question at Christmas dinner, I was no longer chasing the truth. The truth was moving toward them. And very soon, Ethan and Vanessa would have to decide whether they were willing to explain what they had spent more than a decade hiding. The response arrived 8 days later. I knew at the moment I saw Ethan's name on my caller identification. For several seconds, I simply watched the phone ring. Then I answered. His voice sounded strained. Not angry. Not defensive. Tired. He asked whether we could meet in person. I agreed. 2 days later, we sat across from one another in a quiet conference room at Margaret's office. Vanessa arrived a few minutes after Ethan. Neither of them looked comfortable. The confidence I had seen for years was gone. Margaret placed copies of the documents on the table and calmly reviewed the timeline. The financial contributions, the property records, the early planning documents, the correspondence. No accusations, no raised voices, just facts arranged in chronological order. When she finished, silence filled the room. Ethan stared at the table. Vanessa folded and unfolded her hands. Finally, Ethan spoke. He admitted that when the property was first discussed, the intention had been different. My contributions were supposed to provide me with a permanent place at the lake. A place where I could spend summers and eventually retire if I wished. But over time, decisions changed. Plans changed. Conversations became easier to avoid than to explain. One omission became another, then another. Years passed. The truth became something they no longer wanted to discuss. Vanessa quietly admitted that they convinced themselves I would never find out. They believed I was happy in my apartment. They believed bringing up the property would only create complications. I listened without interrupting. What struck me most was not what they said. It was what they did not say. Neither of them could explain why excluding me had ever felt acceptable. Neither could explain why honesty became so difficult. After a long discussion, an agreement was reached. The details mattered less to me than the acknowledgement. My financial contributions were formally recognized. My role in helping create the property was documented. Certain arrangements were made to reflect that reality moving forward. The practical issues could be resolved. What mattered was that the truth finally existed in daylight. Several weeks later, I returned to the lake. This time I did not sit across the road. I walked down to the water. The lake was calm beneath a bright spring sky. Gentle waves touched the shoreline. Birds moved across the surface in the distance. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the cool air. The property looked exactly the same as it had before. Yet everything felt different. Not because of ownership. Not because of money. Because illusions had finally disappeared. I no longer carried the burden of uncertainty. I no longer wondered whether I had imagined the promises made years ago. The truth had survived. As I watched sunlight reflect across the water, I thought about the question that started everything. A simple question from a child who had no idea he was revealing a family secret. One honest sentence had accomplished what 12 years of silence could not. People often assume age makes a person easier to deceive. They assume time dulls memory. They assume trust means blindness. But trust and blindness are not the same thing. Sometimes the truth arrives quietly. Sometimes it takes years. And sometimes the people who believe you will never look closely are the ones most surprised when you finally do.